Again, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us. My name is Stephanie Waller. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I'm the program director at Grantmakers for Education. On behalf of the entire team at EdFunders, I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's program, Toward a Climate of Care in Learning Programs. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, Trust for Learning and the Early Childhood Funders Collaborative, for putting on this session this afternoon. Today's program is the third in a 5-part series exploring formative experiences for children and youth and our country's democratic ideals. And with this series, we want to issue some provocations for the field of philanthropy and for all of us who are in community together about the kinds of mindsets, practices, and commitments that are required in this moment, not just to show up, but really to remain committed and steadfast to the work of pursuing equity and ensuring all young people have access to high-quality learning environments that recognize, celebrate, and center their full humanity. We are joined by truly a phenomenal and dynamic group of expert speakers today. So throughout the conversation, we encourage you to join in. Please engage with and respond to what you're hearing in the chat. Share any questions or reflections as you listen to each of our speakers today. I'm also honored to introduce our moderator, Ellen Roche, who will facilitate the discussion and provide some additional context for today's conversation. Ellen is one of the 3 co-directors of Trust for Learning, a philanthropic partnership working to expand ideal learning environments for all young children and their families from the prenatal period through age 8. She's also working on her PhD in developmental neuroscience, studying how children's brains synchronize with their caregivers during conversation and play. Ellen is especially interested in children's emotional development and how caregivers can support children's agency even very early in life. But before finding herself deep in the ECE and philanthropy spaces, Ellen taught high school, middle school, and pre-K, and worked across issue areas on storytelling campaigns to drive action and awareness, including on climate change and conservation. During those years, she launched campaigns to end mountaintop removal with Sierra Club, worked with World Wildlife Fund on global water conservation, launched a global campaign with Greenpeace on the toxic nature of fast fashion, and supported a local campaign in her home ecosystem to limit toxic agricultural waste in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So she's really well suited to facilitate today's conversation. One common thread between early childhood neuroscience and movement building for sustainable policy change is how we feel about the issues that affect us and whether we feel hopeless and passive or engaged, like we have agency to change things. Ellen is interested in how funders can support the agency of people in communities all around the country to shape their own lives, and this panel speaks directly to that possibility. So without further ado, I'm happy to welcome Ellen and turn things over to you to walk us through our program today.
Stephanie, thank you. And speaking of how people are feeling, I don't know if other people are tuning in later tonight to another conversation, but I think this is going to be a nice antidote and a very hopeful one. So welcome, as Stephanie mentioned, this is the 3rd conversation in our Infant Nation series, where we're trying to connect the dots on investment in public learning environments from prenatal through early adulthood, and really the highest values of our democracy. So we're trying to bring together experts and issues to cross-pollinate and provoke our thinking. One of those intersections is the relationship between climate crisis, the childcare and public education crisis, and finding what are those common substrates. So I've been thinking a lot about this as we've prepared. These are obviously 2 urgent, systemic, really complicated issues that impact all families with children in the United States and around the world. Yet I feel like I'm myself, and I think families in this country are swimming upstream against these systems that are not really designed for them. So we're going to tackle some of these intersections, and each of our panelists has a really distinct perspective on what specifically philanthropic funders can do right now to learn from, take responsibility, and act in solidarity with families who are on the front lines navigating these crises. For me, the central question of this dialogue is how do we collectively insist that children and young people are at the center of all policy discussions that impact their lives, that they're not on the margins or afterthoughts. So I'm going to just very quickly introduce our panelists. They are fabulous. I'll introduce all three and then hand over for the first question. First, I want to welcome my friend, my colleague, Ellicia Lanier. She serves on the board at Trust for Learning. She's part of the Trust for Learning's Ideal Learning Head Start Network, calling in from St. Louis, Missouri, where she is running an absolutely stunning Reggio Emilia-inspired program, early childhood program, serving families from all backgrounds, including families who are part of the Head Start program. At Urban Sprouts, children and families connect with nature on a daily basis, and Ellicia and colleagues at the school center children and families in all aspects of life. And so we're going to hear a lot more about what that looks like. Ellicia, on top of doing all of this work, on top of literally visiting a farm today to do, like, you're going to tell us more about it, but on the go today and always, Ellicia is a powerhouse organizer. If you are on this call thinking, how do we organize and support communities? Get in touch with Ellicia. She is doing it, bringing families and educators together to policy conversations, both at local levels, state levels, national levels. Ellicia, you to me are really a living example of community-driven community change. You have this vision for early childhood, which is about freedom and agency and liberation, not just for children, but for an entire community. So I'm so thrilled that you're here. I will hand over to you in a minute, but let me welcome our other two panelists. Anita Krishnamurthi, welcome. Anita serves as president of the Collective for Youth Empowerment in STEM and Society, which is part of the After School Alliance. She's been there for a number of years and is bringing expertise to this conversation about how to bring young people's energy to policy tables at local, state, and federal tables as these policy agendas are crafted. Young people have been a driving force on climate awareness. I think many of us are drawing both hope, but also responsibility from young people who are speaking up on these issues. So Anita is going to bring perspective on those things, but in addition, served as head of education and learning at the Wellcome Trust based in the UK. So she also has philanthropic experience, global educational perspective. So I'm excited to hear from you what you're hearing from young people and what it will take for funders, private funders, philanthropic funders, to support young people as they shape their communities. And finally, Joan, I will welcome you. So Joan Lombardi. When we do early childhood conversations, I was joking to Joan, you don't need to introduce Joan. You just say, Joan is here, and everybody knows who Joan is. But I know we have folks in the audience from all different age groups developmentally. So Joan has served for many years, decades, as a global leader in the movement for children's rights and sustainable childcare policy. She served as the first Deputy Assistant Secretary for Early Childhood during the Obama administration and the first director of the Child Care Bureau during the Clinton administration. She advises a whole range of global organizations, including UNICEF and the World Bank. And if that were not enough, she's also an active academic and researcher, has done a lot of work on children's experiences during COVID, which have been incredibly valuable new data during that period. She's on faculty at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. Most recently, on top of all these other things, Joan has really devoted herself to learning about and raising awareness of the impacts of climate change on our youngest community members, both here in the US and around the world. So Joan, many of us in early childhood consider you a beacon and giving us a sense of where we should be focusing our attention. So your own awareness on climate has helped, I think, embolden me to start thinking more about how do we bring this in to our thinking and our strategy even more at the Trust. Okay, so enough from me. Let me kick off with a big picture opening question for each of our panelists. So one of my favorite sort of academic interest areas is the history of public education in the United States. And over our centuries of existence as the United States on this land, people have made all kinds of arguments for why we should invest in public education, whether that's early childhood or later. My favorite being that we made so many gains in women's education by arguing several hundred years ago that, oh, we should educate women because they're the ones raising the boys. The real leaders of our country, the boys, need moms who have at least basic literacy. But it got us a step forward in terms of women's education. So at this moment in history, on this land, in this democracy that we are trying to build, what are our visions? And I suspect they do not start and end with kindergarten readiness, third grade reading scores, and graduation rates. So Ellicia, I'm going to hand off to you first. You speak always so beautifully about education for freedom. What does that actually look like every day at Urban Sprouts?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Ellen. I am so grateful to be here and amongst my esteemed colleagues who have such a wealth of information and heart and brain trust in these areas. So I'm excited to share with you all today. But at Urban Sprouts, we really do center that children should have this right to be. And, much of EC is about learning, but it's also about being, right? Coming into your own, have this right to be from the time that they're born. And if we invest in children's potential, we might learn something from them, right? And as we think towards climate change or any of the issues that we're facing, we have to figure out where is the protective space for the people who will be around, for the people that these things will be impacting, and how are they being cared for? How are they being listened to? And how are they being brought into conversations at an early age? Our youngest members of our community have so much to bring to the conversation, and they teach us as we are kind of stale in our thinking sometimes, right? They teach us because they are so open and they are so incredibly connected to the smaller things that we forget about. And so Urban Sprouts really does try to center children in being their best selves and living their best life through this early childhood education. One of the ways that we do that is through caring for our world, right? Making sure that children know how food is grown, how space is taken up, how we treat the environment, how we treat each other. And so I have a very unique position in this space to center the freedom and voice of young children.
Ellicia, thank you. Anita, how do you think about this question from your perspective? What do you think and what do you hear from young people about what they think education should be for at this point in our history?
Yeah, thanks so much for that question, Ellen. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. So I'm going to start off by saying something that might sound glib, but isn't intended to be, which is that I think it's really important that we think of young people as people who happen to be young, right? And what I mean by that is we spend a lot of time focusing on youth and education only as preparation for a future adulthood and future citizenship, instead of who they are right now and what they need in this moment, because they have their own needs, they're having a different lived experience than adults in the here and now, and they have insights and perspectives that we really should be listening to more of the time. And as you said at the beginning, we work with slightly older young people in the program, the youth serving programs that we directly work with. So we work with teenagers, and we talk to teens a lot who are in after school programs, and we make it a point to have conversations with them on a whole host of issues. It's always a learning experience for us, and a really great reminder that learning and growth happens in a lot of spaces as young people seamlessly transition between schools, home, and their out of school time programs and activities like Ellicia's programs. And what we hear from young people over and over is that they really want to be listened to and be partners in their own learning journey. And so you talked about Ellicia saying education for freedom. And what we hear from teenagers really is education for agency, right? They really, really want their learning to be contextualized and see how it relates to the issues and interests they care about, such as the environment and the climate crisis. But they're also very realistic and pragmatic and recognize that they need support and expertise to engage in these conversations and don't want to be left alone to figure it out. They really want intergenerational spaces, and they want to listen with respect to the adults in their lives, but they also want that reciprocated when they talk and bring their views to the table. So they really want to learn the real content knowledge, but also the confidence that they need to be able to speak up about issues they care about and be effective advocates. And as they get older, they definitely start to think about how to be set up to enter the workforce, but also do things that are meaningful to them and help them, that'll help the world be a better place. So they really very keenly feel they don't have control over many decisions, and a lot of things are done to them, and they wish adults would talk with them, create a true dialogue, and influence the policy decisions that affect them. And they appreciate the fact that after-school programs, since we talk to young people in after-school programs, right, like they provide opportunities to gain this agency and an environment where they feel heard. And the takeaway I would like to have people get from this is that we really need to be thinking of all these spaces then as integral as part of young people's learning environments, right? Like they're not necessarily saying, I learn in school and I play in other spaces. They're sort of learning everywhere. And so these spaces that complement school but don't feel like school and can help give them a genuine sense of agency that they're craving, I think we really need to listen to that and sort of make sure that we think of this as a nice portfolio of opportunities and spaces, and not have one look exactly like the other with the exact same goals and outcomes and metrics. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. And I can imagine many of us on this call are going to take that phrase, young people or people who just happen to be young. I love that so much. Joan, I will hand off to you. You've been in this work for many decades. You have global and US perspective. What are you for, the short version as an advocate today?
Well, first of all, thank you, Ellen, and thank you for your commitment and for your developmental perspective and for your dedication to climate, because I do think that's unique and it has inspired me. It's really a joy to be here with Ellicia and Anita because they represent that developmental continuum. And, I think what I want for children, what I see for children is the same that it's been for decades, and that is for them to meet their developmental potential. And Ellicia said it so beautifully when she said their being, really getting in touch with who they are. And, many of us when we're older try to do that, but we haven't been used to that when we were young and had that nurtured, quite frankly, the way it should be in education if you have a developmental perspective. And I think, Anita, your point about, one place is not to learn and one place is not to play. It's all about development, whether it's child development or youth development, and that continuum. I mean, what I'm excited about now is that we have a much clearer picture of what nurturing care is, that includes health and nutrition and responsive parenting and safety and security. But it's not just for young children, it's for the whole developmental perspective. And I think when I look on the horizon, we have a much better, I hope, appreciation for taking a two-generation approach that, parents, our approach to family and our approach to parents should be about listening to them, not assuming that we fill them up with knowledge, that we support them, that we empower them, and that is a key element to a good developmental program. What I'm also excited about is the movement to place-based strategies, and I'm hoping we'll get into that because I think it's gone way beyond a program now. That was Anita's point. These pieces have to fit together, and I think Ellicia's work is really demonstrating that. So we can come back to that.
Amazing, thank you. There are so many questions that I could ask the three of you, and I'm just sitting here thinking, like, how can we all get together and just hang out in DC or anywhere, maybe in St. Louis, and talk more. So getting into the more practical, sort of targeted questions that are really for funders, people who they are sitting on money, they have money to deploy at this moment in history. How do we give us some thoughts and guidance? So I've been thinking in terms of both like paradigm shifts and practice shifts together. And Anita, I'll start with you with a couple of questions from that philanthropic lens. And the first question is, how do we get young people, how do we get the people who are most impacted by these policies to those policy tables? Because it sounds really great in theory, right? To, yes, let's center young people. Nobody's going to say no to that. But take us a little bit more behind the scenes, right? What are the mechanics of that, the logistics? What is the infrastructure and funding needed to actually do that in a sustainable way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, I could talk a little bit about some of the programs, if we have time later, that are doing this with young people. And as Ellicia said, you can start at a lot of different ages, but from the time they're very young. Ours are mostly programs that we work with in our CS community of practice, go 13 and up. And there's some great programs like Technovation, which is an after-school program that sort of helps young girls really use technology to solve, to sort of code for things that aren't always necessarily climate action based, but they promote an environmental equity lens. And so I think Stephanie has a few slides that she might drop into the chat when she can get to it, and you can read more about some of these programs. And so in terms of the funding needed to do more of this kind of work, right? Like we did a study a little while ago because we were trying to really get at what does it take for programs to really, that are offering STEM to really be community centered and youth driven? And how does that, and how are programs doing that? What's getting in the way, et cetera. And what we found is that there were a few recommendations that came from the field when we surveyed them and interviewed many of the program leaders. And I can drop a link to the report in the chat in a minute. But what we found was people were asking us to really incorporate approaches to funding that supported authentic youth-driven and youth-led participatory programming. And what that means is sort of practically application requirements that really try and understand the means by which programs will engage youth instead of the precise nature of the work, because co-creation means that some of that gets done in the process of doing, and ring fencing funding for youth involvement as well, because that it takes money. I mean, young people, especially teenagers, have the choice of going out and getting a job and doing something else. And if you want them to be involved in programs like this, you have to be able to offer them stipends and other kinds of credits that feel meaningful to them. The other big one is really shifting the expectations around evaluation, because we need to focus on developmental evaluation approaches instead of requiring measures that assess the program's final outcomes or impact. And supporting the generation and dissemination of research and knowledge and evidence to really fill the gaps that we have, because there are gaps in the current peer-reviewed literature, right? Like this isn't fully a coherent body of work. When we look at youth-driven programming, there's amazing examples out there, but there isn't necessarily a field that has sort of, that's well theorized and has everything. And so we need more research on that and frameworks for those kinds of assessments and documenting impact. And the final thing I'll say really is that there need to be sort of networks, backbone networks. And I'm not going to say that, like CS is one of those, but there's others like that. And we set CS up because we saw that there were these examples all over the place, but people didn't know about each other. And they weren't able to leverage each other's resources and expertise. And so we're all about sort of community building and capacity building in that sphere. And so, but these kinds of networks are really, really critical because they help build community. And they can mainstream best practices and share lessons learned and broker relationships between the stakeholders to collaborate, coordinate sort of tailored professional development and technical assistance. And so these are not always funded, right? Like they're not the top priorities for funding oftentimes. And so I think we just really need to think about that, is what does it take and how can funders have basically a both and approach, right? You fund the programs on the ground that are doing the work, but how do you also fund the programs and organizations that are helping those programs do the work so that the sum can be more than the parts. And there are some really great examples of funders who are working in this space to support youth. A lot of them are in the sort of social justice and civic engagement space, I think. And as you mentioned at the beginning, since I moved here from the UK just a couple of years ago, there's one foundation there that I look at, and they went through a visioning process with young people in the communities, and they came up with the Future Communities vision. And it's not as if funders here don't do that and they're unique, but the thing I love about it is that one of the strategic priorities that came out of this was that they committed to create communities that prioritized youth activism, shared power, and were sustainable. Right. And they were like pillars of their strategy going forward. So it's how can we do more of that? And the final thing, of course, is long-term funding, right? Like funders hear this all the time, but it's really true when you're sort of fundraising on a year-to-year basis. It's hard work when you're trying to do these things that you're often playing a long game. And it takes time to realize the potential and the vision that you have in mind. And so sort of the 3 to 5 year funding schemes are the ones that really bear fruit. And so I think it's this dialogue we need to have with funders about where are your pain points in being able to do that, and what can we do to sort of make this work on both sides.
There's so much in that, Anita, thank you. And I'm going to transition over to you, Ellicia, but there's a core thread around trusting people. And I'm thinking back in the last week, I've both reviewed grant reports that we've received from partners that we give funds to. I've also drafted grant reports to the folks who give us money. And there is this temptation to do sort of bean counting, right? Well, was it 350 children or 360 children, right? And the sort of emphasis on quantitative metrics. But there's this through line of like, what if we trusted people to develop their vision of what they want? And Ellicia, I feel like that's such a beautiful segue to you telling us about, and I would love for everyone to hear about Cafe Au Play, and also the work you're doing on your block, which is ongoing. So how do you center and trust even the very youngest community members to figure out what their outcomes are for themselves?
Child, my most favorite human to talk to is a 2-year-old. You know, I really do think that when we slow down and we give agency, like you give space for agency, because you cannot give it, and we allow folks to be a part of what's important to them, we can see beauty for ashes. And I can remember when a group of children in our program would hear myself and some of the parents talk about going to have coffee in different meetings and meeting people for coffee. And it sparked this interest in the children's play to meet each other for coffee. So we were seeing it on the playground. We were seeing it in the classroom. And I mean, they had their pinkies up. And some had iPad fake blocks that were iPads and like meeting notes, you know, their theory. But it was an opportunity for them to make an appointment with someone, right? To set aside time to be with someone. And so we started exploring, and I'm laughing because the stories that came out of this work are so beautiful. We've kept them. This work started in 2017. This work started in 2017, this exploration of coffee shops. And we kept the children understanding of what these coffee shops meant to them. And really, they just wanted to be with people. So we took them to a couple different coffee shops, one that was a major name brand that we're all aware of, and it's great. They had a good time. And then we took them to a community coffee shop where the parents and their children worked in this coffee shop. And there was resemblance of people that looked like them. And there were tables that had murals that reflected the community around this coffee shop. And the children fell in love. So we came back to our school, we used that research, and we created a coffee shop within our community. We worked with over 100 children and parents to develop a name. The children drew different iterations of what they wanted the logo to be, and we came up with Cafe Au Play. Fast forward, we went into the pandemic and we found that food sovereignty, because, you know, I have my different views on this mentality of like scarcity and sovereignty, but anyway, food sovereignty. So where food was sourced, who was cooking it, and how people got it was very important in our community. And so we deployed so much food across St. Louis for both our children and children and their children across, I think it was like 38 zip codes. And in doing that, we found that people really care what they eat. And so in this new campus that we are building, we are saving the buildings on the rest of our block. We've done some like natural cleanups, and we're putting in a Cafe Au Play that was born by children. The logo is still the same. It was created by a child who's now in 3rd grade. And we are watching the story unfold very beautifully, and it's going to become a place where there can be a sort of a social venture opportunity to serve coffee and for people to meet in the morning, and then in the afternoon, it will be a place where children can dine for free with their parent or without, and they can come and get a hot meal and keep their dignity intact. And it's so critical. You know, the pandemic Ellen and I talk all the time. I don't know if I talked or cried more. I can't remember. But it did something to slow us down, and it just increased the amount of listening. And there were days where all you could do was just hold each other, right? And so it changed how we look at our work. It caused us to stop doing things and be more intentional, and take our intentionality to a place that, is the sustainability of our program, right? And that children have a voice in what the future looks like for future generations. And that families in this 2-gen approach, Joan, that you talked about, are being cared for. Because I used to go around screaming, whole child, whole child. Baby, if the family is not good, the child is broken, okay? And so we have invested in, on this new campus, these opportunities based on listening to families, these opportunities to build health and wealth on the campus, and for us to dive deep into the goals of families and the wishes and the hopes. That we center ourselves in the hopes and dreams of people. And you'd be surprised. Most times there are things that we can do together, but it's in that listening, in that hearing, in that, hey, I can help you go here. Oh, I know somebody who want to be an auto mechanic. Great. Let me walk down the street and talk to Jeff. He's been working on cars for 30 years, right? It's all of those things and how we keep things going. And so as we think about trusting people with the dollars to do this kind of work, where does it land on our priority list? As a funder, it should land on your people priority list, right? Prioritize people. And when you do that, trust me, these stories will be born and they'll be sustained, because when it's for us and by us, there's a protective factor. And you will see investments like ours just continuing to ripen over time.
Ellicia, thank you. And Joan, I feel like your perspective on this, which ranges from global, truly global, to hyperlocal, tell us as funders, tell us, for the funders listening, what should we be focused on? What should we be doing?
Well, I think Ellicia just did it. First of all, I have to say, in my heart, I'm a preschool teacher. And so when I hear her, really, it's what excites me about working with children, that you listen to them and you follow what they're interested. Same thing you do with school-age children, right? You follow what they're interested in. And we've gotten so into, here are the outcomes we have to find, that we've forgot to listen. But I think you could translate that for funders too. So what happens as funders? You have expectations of your board members, you have a strategy that you just invested in, But what I think you're hearing here is start by listening to what communities want, what families want, and be creative in your response. Take risks. And I realize it's easier to say that than when you have pressure of a board and a strategic plan that you have to fulfill. But I think you have to push the envelope a little here. And really, I'm very excited about the philanthropic movement to look at place and to invest in place. And I'm seeing it domestically and I'm seeing it all around the world. I think part of that, to bring us back to environmental issues, is looking at neighborhood conditions. And I don't just mean the changing climate, I mean the environmental risks that many communities have been putting up with for decades that really start with environmental justice. Climate is making those things worse, but they've always been there. And so if we listen to communities, especially about this issue, about the climate issue, they may not be calling it. I just had an experience like this where I said, are you feeling the effects of climate? And someone, this was not in the US, someone said to me, no, we have a lot of drought. And they weren't making the connection that we assume they make, or it's really hot, but it's not climate change. So I think as funders take risks, listen to communities, make the linkages. I had another experience this morning where I was talking to a funder who really wanted to do something around early childhood and climate. And she said, but the climate people in my foundation really don't see the connection with children. And so we had to brainstorm, how can you show them that the face of the changing climate is children? And we certainly see that around the world, but we're seeing it here too. And how do you, as a funder, bring your climate people and your children's people together in the same room? Same thing at the community level. I think funders have a unique role in bringing people together. And certainly around these issues, they can. But Ellicia, you made me want to be a preschool teacher again.
Come on, Joan. Yes, I'm a preschool teacher for life. Yes.
Really?
And Ellen, if I may jump in, right, like, and just to follow up on what Joan was saying, as well as Ellicia, I think in some of the links that Stephanie dropped, and I didn't get a chance to really talk about these programs, but I think programs like Earth Force and Trouble & Co. and CAPE, what they're really focused on is really helping young people identify and explore environmental concerns in their local communities, right? And developing and implementing a community project that then results in them taking it to a decision maker to ask for a change that'll benefit everyone. And the Trouble & Co program in particular is a really interesting one because they have something called Mapping Justice, where they really are trying to teach high school students how to use GIS data to design geospatial tools, to really look at what's happening in that community and sort of have things like environmental justice and racial justice all come together to see STEM very much as a tool for sort of what they call liberatory innovation, right? So it's teaching these young people real technical skills, but also teaching them about how to use it for sort of social impact and social good, and showing them that they're capable of making change in their own communities. And I can't remember whether it was you or Ellicia who said that at the beginning, right? Like, the antidote to despair and cynicism is action. Totally. Right? And so how do we help young people and adults who are all feeling very anxious about what's going on with the climate crisis to gain the knowledge and the skills to figure out how to tackle it, and whether it's mitigation, adaptation, it's going to be a combination of both of those things, right? And so, but it's rooted in knowledge, both content knowledge, but also the advocacy knowledge on how to make change. And we need to start with that young, because that's a muscle that you build. It's very hard to it could be scary for someone who's never done it before, right? Unless you're activated, and people get activated for a variety of different reasons on different issues. But I think that's one of the purposes of education. As I said, it is for agency, it's for citizenship. It's how do you learn to apply all this knowledge to tackle issues that you care very deeply about, and how do you support young people to practice those skills and knowledge in real world context, whether that's done in schools or after school programs. And really, it's a combination of both, because learning happens everywhere and play should be happening in both places as well.
Right.
Yeah, that is a wonderful synthesis of some of the things that I'm hearing. And I think I'm going to move us into my last question and encourage people to put questions in the chat. It's amazing how quickly an hour can go. I want to make sure that each of you has time to just plug what are you working on right now that you want to make sure people know about, that maybe things that need philanthropic resources, or that partners are working on, or any other final thoughts you want to share about kind of this moment and what we can all be doing. Anita, as you put it so beautifully, to practice this muscle, right, of taking action and not being overwhelmed and lapsing into despair, but building that muscle in ourselves individually and collectively. And I will just share a couple of resources that, so I work at Trust for Learning. I didn't talk too much about our work, but we are a philanthropic partnership supporting what we call ideal learning environments for children across the US in publicly funded settings. Ellicia is a big part of our work. And one of the ways, and Joan, truly, you are one of the people in the constellation who've helped us shape how we are thinking about integrating nature-based learning, these larger sort of forces in children's lives. And I have not been super closely involved with this, but my colleagues at the Trust and a whole group of experts have been working on a bunch of resources about connecting children to nature. So this is an area where if you have resources, if you are wealthy, you can maybe afford an outdoor preschool, right? If you do not have as many resources financially or depending on where you live, it's really difficult to access nature safely. So we've got lots of resources that I'll put in the chat, and that is the plug that I want to share, because one of those early experiential things is falling in love with the natural world, seeing your place as a part of your local ecosystem. So that's a big part of our work. So I'll drop those in the chat. And Anita, will you kick us off with sort of, plugs that you want to make, other calls to action, and I'll keep an eye out for questions.
Sure. Thanks for that, Ellen. Thanks for that chance. So I think I've been saying this all along, right? Like some of this is around the impetus for systems building work and funding, and really having that both and approach of funding both programs that are doing great work on the ground, like Ellicia, as well as groups like us. And I'll just talk about the After School Alliance as an example, knowing there are many, many great advocacy organizations out there, because advocacy is often hard to fundraise for. But it's really crucial, and it's a long game that we play in advocacy with enormous payoffs, because the outcomes have to reflect the trust and relationship building work and the process of actually doing this work. But by sticking with this and doing this for over 20 years now, we've been able to really preserve the funding for after school programs against cuts and threats, and just keep growing it steadily so that millions of young people have access to after school programs as a result of our advocacy, as well as those of our partners and allies at sort of state and local levels. So definitely a plug for advocacy. And the other thing I'll say about this initiative that I'm currently really working on, which is the Collective for Youth Empowerment in STEM and Society, is that we are really trying to be that kind of infrastructure organization to encourage and support more after-school programs to operate at that intersection of STEM learning and teen empowerment and civic engagement, and to really think about STEM learning, not just for workforce development, which is sort of a default narrative, but also as a critical tool for just citizenship nowadays, right? Like no matter what you do, there needs to be a certain level of STEM literacy that we all need to have. And what better way to engage young people than to show them why it's relevant and matters in their communities, no matter what they go on to do. And like with any field, some fraction of them will pursue it into a profession, But what we need to do is increase the number of young people who feel like it is for them. It's a tool they can use. We don't run programs, but we support programs to really come together and so that more programs can do this work. So I'd love funding for CS, but similarly funding for programs and organizations like this that are really working hard to be the intermediary organizations and really support programs to be all that they can be and more. Thank you for that chance.
Amazing. Thank you. Ellicia, final words and or things you're working on that you want to make sure people are aware of.
I will say, speaking sort of to the nature brief and bringing awareness to the climate and things that are happening around in your community and in the world really does start early. And what's beautiful about ECE work is that you get the attention of parents. Like parents really, really pay attention from 0 to 5, right? They're still trying to figure out what is this parenting lens and all of that. So we have this ability to sneak in that 2-gen approach and become partners in how they show up for a world that they would like to see. And so we are, I think I saw Shannon put in the chat, we do offer lots of food sovereignty opportunities for our families, from growing their own food on the property, children preparing it and getting involved in how it gets to them and how what we do in this urban neighborhood can affect what our, green space looks like. So we're trying to buy up as much as we can to keep our footprint light, right? And to put as much green space as we can, off of it in an urban community can be challenging. But these things can be done with people who have the power of their dollars, right? To put in communities like ours of folks that are ready to invest in the people and the members that are there. Yeah, I don't know. We're working on a lot of stuff. We're engaging providers and community and early childhood stakeholders through lots of listening, and our new community of practice is something that we're really each interested in, of not like always going for doing more, but what are the opportunities to, we have a waiting list, I think, of like almost 500 children. So what does it mean to engage the other early childhood centers around us to be thinking and doing and listening in this way through our community of practice, right? So it's also about that sharing. So funders, yes, invest in people who are willing to share models that do work for community.
Yeah, for sure.
Joan, before I hand over to you for your thoughts, Ellicia, I want to call out and highlight another specific thing about your program that I just found so incredibly extraordinary. So Ellicia and Joan were both at the Trust's board friends and family meeting back in May, and Ellicia was sitting next to me at dinner, and somebody calls her on FaceTime, and she's like, "Oh, meet my friend Ellen, meet my person." And so I'm on FaceTime, with Ellicia at dinner, and the woman, and do you remember her name? Because I'm forgetting what her name was, Ellicia. Do you remember who it was?
Was it Donda?
It might have been Donda, and forgive
Or
me if
Melissa.
It sounds familiar.
Yeah.
So this woman appears on screen. I'm like, "Hi, I'm Ellen." And she proceeds to give me the most spectacular tour of a space in Urban Sprouts called the Makerspace. And
yes.
and she walks us through, and the Makerspace is spectacular. If people are interested, send me an email, I'll connect you with Ellicia and we'll send photos. But the Makerspace is this beautiful resource library of objects, and Ellicia would love to have you share a little bit more. But what I want to highlight is that okay, I'm stunned by this, right? And I say, "Okay, Ellicia, who is this woman?" Thinking she must be the VP of the Makerspace, the assistant principal, like on staff. And she said, "Oh, she's a mom." Right. And so the idea of centering not just children, but families to fully feel like the environment is yours. And I'll plug actually another thing. We have a video coming out about our work in to support people creating ideal learning environments in Head Start. Ellicia and her program and her colleague LaDonna featured in that video. And Ellicia, you say something, I don't know if you remember this, but I've been watching all the footage. You say, I want children to understand that you walk into a space and it's yours. And that feeling of belonging. So I stole all your thunder just then, but I want to.
It's okay.
You want to
Yeah,
share
but I
anything
think,
about that?
you know, Joan will love this. Like when I went to Italy, I'm like, oh, okay, we're doing this wrong. One of the spaces that I went to was the Ramita. And when we talk about sustainability, like there's something very beautiful when children can take trash and turn it into treasure. So this maker space that she speaks of, and the parent was Paula Vickers. She's a very active parent. And she was down in the space because it also doubles as our community co-working space. So our families can come and they can co-work and use our internet. So we have moms and dads who come down there, they take their Zoom calls and they work from our place. But this makerspace really is around how do we continue to resource and source what we need from what we already have, right? So it's that, you know, it's all of these materials from people's homes and collections of things, and they're beautiful. And we've made them become our trash to treasure. So this idea of buying something new is not where we're at, right? It's what can things become that have already had its turn in life. So, you know, I don't, you know, there's something even deeper to that, right? If I look at the Maya, just so much culture and rebirth. And I think that that rebirth is just so incredible for communities that are looking to hold on to something. And we can start with even the material choices that we use in our environment. So yeah, that's what that was.
Thank you. And Joan, I'm going to hand over to you to close us out. We did get one question in the chat about if any of us are familiar with funders who can fund, I think in other parts of the world, children affected by climate change. So maybe our panelists, if you know of those funders, write them in the chat. And Joan, I will hand off to you. We have just a couple minutes of like closing stuff from Stephanie and I, but you know, connect the dots for us a little bit as we close out. What do you hope funders are taking away? And I love just this vision, Ellicia, that you've left us with of really helping everyone feel like the environment is theirs and not in a proprietary, I get to do whatever I want to it, but in a collective care kind of way.
And that's the goal, right? I mean, I love the rebirth. You know, I thought, Ellicia, the first article I ever wrote back in the early 70s, I think it was, sorry to admit, before some people were born, was Don't Throw Them Away. That was the name of the article. And it was about, but I never thought of it as rebirth. It's a beautiful image. I will plug what each of them plugged, first of all, because I think with Ellicia's program showcasing what is possible and the excitement in early childhood, really, I want to see that happen again. I know that some of the early childhood funders recently visited. They came back so excited. That's what I want to see happen, is people get excited. And so I think, you know, showcasing it, bringing people to see it, getting other teachers to see it so they get excited. And with Anita, I think it's so important that funders leverage public dollar, that you invest in networks like the Alliance that are then leveraging public dollar, because the philanthropic dollar cannot pay for the services that we need, but they can leverage it. They can use their power and their, not just their resources, but their voice, I think, to make a difference. I think my final plea to funders is think big and think small. I'm really into seeing what I'm calling micro green grants, small amounts of funding to groups around the country and around the world that would document the impact of climate, and a lot of activity around youth doing that. So I think there's a lot you can do with small amounts of money. But on the thinking big side, I'm very excited about the greening of education. I'm excited about what we can do, but children should not have to be the answer to this. We have to, and I'm asking the funders to invest in saying no to fossil fuel, saying no to the things that are contributing to climate change, because for the world's children, this is not tomorrow's issue. They are suffering today, whether it's flooding, heat, air pollution, and I think we saw that this summer here in the US. So I want to put a sense of urgency behind the need to take some of your resources and to address the reasons behind climate and to just say, no, that's not the future that our children need.
Thank you, Joan. I'm nodding vigorously over here and thinking about how we can collectively share these messages and yeah, link arms and say, this is what we want for our country, for our children. Thank you. We are just at 4 minutes to the hour. I know Stephanie has some closing thoughts to close us out, but I will shout out as I transition to her the fact that Lucy Racio, another very, very dear colleague, is in the chat. She's been up in the chat commenting, and she will be our moderator for our next episode of this series, which we have daringly decided to schedule at 2 p.m. the day before the election. So it will be a nice breath of fresh air. And that session is called, I think, Relationship as Revolution. Right. So how do we build these relationships to further the change we know is possible? Thank you, Ellicia. Thank you, Joan. Thank you, Anita. Yeah, can't wait to talk more with each of you. And Stephanie, I will hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I just want to double down on the thanks and appreciation to each of our speakers, Ellicia, Anita, Joan, and Ellen again for facilitating that really powerful conversation. I'm stuck with a couple of things from your discussion, but I think, Anita, your point around action being the antidote to cynicism and despair is like exactly what I needed to walk away with. So thank you all for the work that you're doing to combat that cynicism and despair and the action that you're taking with our young people, with families, in communities, in context to give young people the opportunity to flex those muscles and practice that agency. Thank you again to everyone for joining us this afternoon. By way of a couple just very quick closing announcements, we will be sharing the recording from this afternoon session, as well as the registration link for our conversation on November 4th. So we do hope that you'll join us. We love for you to stay connected to us, so you can use the QR code you see there to sign up for updates from Ed Funders. We also have just a quick announcement about some upcoming programs in the coming weeks. We have our Out of School Time monthly field convening on September 20th, and we're gearing up for our in-person annual conference in Minneapolis, so you can register for that until October 1st. We hope you'll join us. And again, thank you all so much for being here this afternoon, and we look forward to talking with you again soon. Have a great week.